guess we can start now.
Yeah, sure.
Welcome everybody, good afternoon. I'm supposed to be timekeeper here.
You're the timekeeper, okay.
Just keeping things in order. I'm CK Law. Welcome you all to the Department of Social Work and Social Administration. We have a distinguished guest this afternoon to share with us. I guess you read the poster, so probably I shouldn't spend time introducing Professor Perry. The reason he is here with us is because he's a visiting scholar here at University of Hong Kong, and he's been the editor-in-chief of the Public Administration Review Journal, and that's why his topic today with us was research and publishing in the social sciences, the case of public administration. Without further ado, let me give you Professor Perry.
I'm going to put this down because I think you can probably hear it.
Thanks, I appreciate the invitation from Cecilia, the department head, or the head, I should say. I'm not entirely, even though I've been around Hong Kong U for many years, versed in the terminology. But yes, I'm here for actually 3 years, 4 months a year, so I won't be spending the whole year here, but parts of the year, and I've just spent the first 2 years. My first trip, I think, to Hong Kong U goes back to about 1991. Oh, I think I also visited in probably 1986 when I was a Fulbright at Chinese University. I also thank Cecilia for using the oldest picture that I gave her, the one that makes me look about 12 years younger than I really am. Thank you, I appreciate that. What can I say? I'm happy to look back on the picture of my youth. Come on in. Yeah. Okay, so let me give you a little preview of what I want to talk about. What I'd like to do is talk about 20 to 25 minutes. I'm looking at the clock, and the clock is a little fast here. Come in, Helen. Welcome. And then I'd like to have a conversation because, I can sort of share some of the things that I've experienced as the editor of this journal. And to some extent, I wanted to try to pull out of the editor's role and to think bigger or share bigger thoughts with you. But it's a little hard given the fact that many of you are in the social work area, I'm in the public administration area. There are some intersections. But I think a conversation about some of the issues that might be on your mind and maybe some of the experiences that I've had that might be useful, I think is perhaps a good use of our time. So I'm not going to talk forever. I'm going to talk about 25 minutes. So here's sort of the list of things that I'd like to cover. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of background about the seminar goals for those of you that didn't read the handout. And then I want to talk a little bit about public administration review. Second thing I'd like to do is to talk to you about what I mean by research, because we don't all have the same notion of research when we're talking about research. So I'm going to share with you, I think, a sort of a broader perspective of research that I think is consistent with the field of social work. And personally, I see a lot of connection between social work and public administration. I consider my journal, for instance, to be a professional journal. I also have a daughter who has a Master of Social Work from one of the oldest programs in the U.S., so I also know some social workers. And she drives me crazy, but she is my daughter. Predictions and advice about research that is likely to be well received by Quality Journal. I wish I could sort of gear this more to the social work field, but we also have some other guests here, people from public administration, public policy, geography, and elsewhere, so that we have a pretty broad audience. So to some extent, I hope I'm going to touch on things that are of relevance to you with respect to doing quality research and publishing that quality research. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about what I call non-research considerations to enhance publishing in high-quality journals. This is sort of what we editors know about things that don't happen, that could happen, that might increase your prospects for getting in the top journal. So those are the items I want to talk about. Let me go to the first thing. This was on the handout. I just want to remind you 2 items I said I would talk about. I'm going to try to talk about what types of research are likely to be well received by quality journals. And I wish I could talk to you, for instance, about what are the 5 cutting-edge issues in social work. I can't talk to you about the 5 cutting-edge issues in social work because I don't know what they are. Although I suspect there's probably, if somebody articulated those 5 cutting-edge issues, they'd probably look a lot like some of the cutting-edge issues I'm looking for in my journal. But I will probably have some sort of generic suggestions. Some of my slides even refer to generic. But since we have a number of how many of you are doctoral students? Doctoral, PhD, okay, so we have a number of PhD students. So you're, in some respects, on the outside looking in, so you're probably not privy to all the things that some of our well-seasoned travelers and scholars are familiar with. And then I want to talk about these other non-research considerations that might be relevant. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background about public administration review. We are now, and there are a few extra copies up here if you want to grab one. We're nearing 75 years of publication. This website here, www.publicadministrationreview.org, is the 75th anniversary website. On that site we have a list of the 75 most influential articles from the journal selected by our editorial board. We have the good fortune of having published a few pieces from Nobel laureates, Herbert Simon, Eleanor Ostrom, but we have other prominent people who have contributed, people who those folks in public administration would be familiar with their names simply because of their contributions over the years. Journals owned by the American Society for Public Administration, published by Wiley Blackwell under an agreement with them since the year 2000. We have more than 5,600 institutional subscribers globally. I don't know how that fares relative to the social work journals. It's a pretty wide expanse. The other number that I'm particularly impressed by, 900,000 article downloads in 2013, and Wiley tells me that if you're from China and you're interested in a social science journal, you might well be downloading articles from Public Administration Review because about 10% of those 900,000 downloads are done in China. Now, that speaks to a lot of things. I think one of the things it speaks to is the journal's been around for a while. It has some of these classic articles. It also speaks, I think, to students. It speaks to faculty in training their students and developing their students, but it also says something, I think, about the quality of research that appears in the journal. Impact factor is modest. I can talk about that at length later if you would like me to talk about that a little bit later. There are 47 journals included in the Web of Science, I think, in this category, Public Administration and Policy. We're 11th on the 5-year impact factor. We were number 1 on the Google Scholar. This year we're number 2 out of 20 journals. Next year we'll probably still be 2 or 3. 3 years from now we'll be number 1 again. But that's sort of 3 years from now. But one of the things that let me note, impact factors lag significantly, and clearly, how a journal is faring today may not be reflected in these numbers. I certainly think we can do better on some of these numbers, but we're doing pretty well in general, I would say. And certainly the 900,000 article downloads is testimony to the relevance of the journal. Okay, what qualifies as research? I need to move fast because I tend to move slowly sometimes by sharing too much information. There was a book, actually, it was published and going back by Princeton University Press by a gentleman named Ernest Boyer. He was the president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, which is headquartered or located in Stanford, California, or Palo Alto. The title of the book he did was Scholarship Reconsidered, published in 1990, and there were a number of other repercussions. I looked on this, I said, well, how many people have paid attention to this? I went to the Google Scholar metric, and there were 8,000 hits on this particular source. So somebody in the American universities and probably elsewhere are paying attention to this particular piece. But one reason why I think it's useful is it talks about scholarship in a variety of ways. He identified in the 1990 book 4 types of scholarship. The normal that we think about, discovery, generating new knowledge. That's what scholarship has typically and historically been all about. But it's not all that it's about. He talks also about this notion of integration. We can talk about integration in a variety of ways. One is the integration across different fields. For instance, I like to think about public administration as an interdisciplinary field. That means it should be drawing from economics and sociology and social work and everywhere else, and trying to integrate that into an understanding that helps people in administrative roles. The same is probably true of social work. The tendency, I think, and one of the reasons why Boyer wrote his book was that we don't necessarily have disintegration in the academy, but we certainly have lots of different, what we might call, what we would call in the U.S. silos. That is, that we have a group working here and they're working in their silo, and we have a group over here working in their silo, and we're not sort of integrating things as we might. But clearly, that Boyer argued is an important form of scholarship, one that's very important to me as a journal editor of a sort of a general purpose journal like Public Administration Review. Another one is application. We're not only interested in discovering new knowledge, but we're interested in putting that new knowledge to work, and it may be that the new knowledge is not as good as we think it is, and we need to be able to apply it. And then fourth, he talked about the scholarship of teaching, which I think has blossomed since he wrote this book. But clearly the scholarship of teaching is important. It's not one that's of primary interest to me today, although before I became the editor of the journal that I edit now, I was also the editor of a new journal called the Journal of Public Affairs Education. It wasn't quite new, but it got a new title when I became the editor. And it's the journal that's published by the Network of Schools of Public Affairs, Policy, and Administration out of Washington, D.C. So those are 4 different types of scholarship. And the reason I sort of want to call them to your attention is because most of them are important to me. Certainly the first 3, discovery, integration, and application, are important to me as a journal editor. They're also important to me as an editor or someone involved in a professional field. It's not that I'm in my ivory tower. I had a conversation with somebody in another faculty this morning talking about the nature of new faculty. What he wasn't saying they were in the ivory tower, but they were at their computers diligently working in their little, I won't say cubicle, nice office, not necessarily jockey, in this tower, but so we have some folks that sort of have a different orientation than we do. I think though, clearly in social work, public administration, we have a much more expansive view of what's relevant to us. Okay, so let me also say a little bit about what I consider to be modern challenges or pressures, because the academy is not the same today as it was when I was an assistant professor. I should note that my assistant professor days started in 1974. So it was a long time. I may look like a kid, but I was actually proud. I was just a little bit, what's his, Prince William or whatever, who's doing his world tour now? He's 8 months old. I started, George. And this may be directed as much toward public administration people, the first bullet, but in our zeal to be helpful, overcoming our disposition to chase the latest fads and create theory from unexamined practice. And by that I mean is, for instance, those of us who are attached to practitioners, you are attached to social work practitioners, I'm attached to public policy and public administration practitioners, are often driven by the wow factor of what the practitioners come to us and say, this is really good, the greatest thing since sliced bread, as a matter of fact, and you need to do it. And so we try to turn it into a theory and we write about it in our journals, even though one is it may simply be replicating things we've known for a long time, we just are not connecting to that knowledge. Or it may be bad ideas altogether. and we haven't looked at it carefully. So I think we need to be careful about, particularly in professional fields, about pursuing something that reflects what's hot out in the world today, but may not necessarily be the foundation for developing that lasting knowledge about our profession. We also need to be attentive to what I say, rising above short-term behaviors precipitated by reward systems, university rankings, pressures to publish in SSCI journal. Now I know, and we've got faculty here, we've got doctoral students here, that I know what your reality is. Some of my understanding of these pressures are associated with my teaching at Yonsei University in Seoul. But Yonsei administrators would put a bounty on an SSCI article. University of Georgia, as a matter of fact, I'm told my public administration colleagues, each year, for instance, they had an annual merit review, and if they didn't have something on their vita for that merit review, they were out. You know, they didn't get the raise or they didn't get the crediting. You know, those I perceive those as sort of short-term pressures, incentives that may not be that may drive you to behave in one way, but may not necessarily be in the interest of generating knowledge in the long run. So somehow we need to find ways of overcoming those. I don't have the answers to that, although we certainly could have a conversation about that later. But certainly that's one of the pressures we need to deal with. We also have the issue of human and financial resources for high quality research. Good research sometimes takes lots of money. Where do we get it? You have some benefits here in Hong Kong, actually, with the access to the RGC monies and the fact that the government of Hong Kong funds research in the universities here probably much better than we are funded in the U.S. in terms of access to monies, although this varies by universities. University at Albany, State University of New York, when I visited there a number of years ago, they were awash in money. Their problem was that the state government kept bringing dump trucks up to the back of the university and dumping that money there, saying, spend it. I'm told there's a similar phenomenon in Macau because of all their gambling money. But the reality is that we need revenues, we need funds sometimes to do research, but not all research takes lots of money. Certainly we shouldn't use that as the absence of money as an excuse for not being able to get the research done. But we may need to be creative sometimes to do high quality research when we don't have the necessary human and financial resources. And then diversity of languages and cultures. As a journal editor that gets 400 manuscripts a year, almost 50% of them from outside the U.S., many of them from China, Korea, Europe. There's one of our authors over there, Professor Torfing from Denmark. I've sort of learned that, for instance, the English, how do I say this? The Europeans talk about different terms and may apply different labels to the same terms that we use in the U.S. And then we have another set of languages and sort of cultural backgrounds in Asia. Clearly that in terms of trying to integrate, we talk about integrating the scholarship, but integrating also across the cultures and the languages and the different ways the different mindsets in different countries, that's a challenge. So these are what I would call some challenges and pressures. Okay, generic considerations. And let me move quickly here so we have time for discussion. Research is a social process, and I think I direct this as much to the doctoral students, although maybe if there are others who don't consider it a social process. I know, for instance, when I was a young scholar in '74, moving into the academy, one of the things I learned, matter of fact, I learned probably learned more in the first 5 years I was a faculty member than I could possibly have learned when I was a doctoral student. Why? Because I went from an environment, public administration, to a school of administration, and I interacted with behavioral scientists and psychologists and others And I had to sort of change my sort of view of the world, change the connections I had with journals and the like. So I learned a lot through the course of the early part of my career. But that was a social process, and I think that's one of the things. I get lots of emails, inquiries about, is this article something that public administration review would be interested in? Well, don't ask me. Ask the journal. Pick this up and look at the journal. But if you're in a public administration program, you ought to be having that conversation with junior or senior colleagues. You ought to be having that conversation with practitioners. Although I might be a quick answer or provide a quick answer for you, I may not provide the best answer. And for somebody to be asking me that question probably tells me that they may have not been doing what they needed to be doing in order to learn the field prior to submitting a manuscript to us. Peer review as it begins early in your formulation of research questions. So, clearly that's again a social process. Colleagues care about the quality of research and new knowledge. One of the sort of most interesting anecdotes about one of my mentor, Charlie Levine, was that there was a young scholar who actually this year won the Charlie Levine Memorial Award. He had no personal connection with Levine, sent him a manuscript. Those are in the old days before you would send manuscripts electronically. You'd send it the old version. And then all of a sudden, three weeks later, he gets this 3-page letter from this guy who he didn't know him, but who is interested in advancing knowledge. I think that's part of what the Academy is about. And certainly, again, I think reinforces this notion that you need to reach out to other people in terms of developing your research and formulating your ideas. Find mentors who are familiar with the process. This is certainly important for doctoral students. And the other issue here, discover and study exemplars. We know, for instance, what in public administration review, for instance, last year the best article was a panel study of actually Danish veterans from the Afghan War, or maybe it was from the Iraq War. Look at the prize-winning papers. They tell you something about not only what sells, but what may be quality research. So clearly, that again is a part of this process of knowledge dissemination with which you need to connect yourself in order to get on sort of the cutting edge and develop quality research yourself. Okay, preparing the research. Some of these are sort of basic ideas, but I think this one bears some repeating. Situate your research in a body of scholarship or theory. Here's the extreme example. Somebody comes to me and says, has anybody studied X in public organizations? And I say, no, they have not studied X. And so the person who's doing the study says, good, I don't have to do a literature review. I was sort of in that same situation when I was a doctoral student. I was studying collective bargaining in local governments. That was within 3 years of the first law in the U.S. And nobody knew anything about collective bargaining, particularly from a behavioral standpoint. Did that mean there was nothing about it? No. There were negotiation scholars, there were game theorists, there were sociologists studying conflict. There was a whole wealth of information about it that could be knit together to create a theoretical and empirical foundation that would guide my research. One of the sort of and this second bullet relates to that. One of my irritants with authors is to say, okay, I'm going to do a literature review. Let me look. I'm interested in child welfare, but I'm only going to look at child welfare at the state level because I'm studying a state organization. Well, there's a lot to be said maybe about child welfare in county organizations or local government organizations or a variety of other contexts. And if you say, I am only going to study the type of organization in which I'm going to do my study, then you're going to miss out on all sorts of important information. So I call this suboptimal boundaries. I referred to it in an earlier version of the slide as artificial, but we need to get beyond. And then, now this goes again back to Boyer's point about integration. Social work can be very comfortable if we say we're only going to study the stuff that we find in social work journals. It can also become very irrelevant to the cutting edge of important scholarship. The same is true in public administration. This sort of tells you a little bit about my thinking as the editor and where I'd like to move the journal. But clearly, we need to sort of look beyond the boundaries where we've been in maybe what some people would call normal science for the last 30 years. We need to sort of strike out in new areas. And then seek rigor, and I suggest here replacing traditional narrative reviews with research syntheses or meta-analyses. This is one of my hobby horses, but the Handbook of Research Synthesis, for instance, talks about 3 types of reviews. Narrative reviews, research syntheses, which are systematic, and meta-analyses, which are sort of manipulation of the underlying statistical information. As a journal editor and also as a scholar, I've sort of begun to dismiss the narrative reviews. When somebody says, okay, there are 4 studies that are relevant and runs through a paragraph on each one of those studies and said, here's what I've discovered. 1, it's not very interesting to me, and 2, it probably doesn't, I begin to question whether or not they've sort of done sort of a comprehensive look at what's available to assess the research that's relevant to their study. So rigor, I think, is important, particularly on the review of research or the literature reviews. And I think this is an area, and again, I'm not tweaking faculty here, but an area where we historically have not spent a lot of effort as faculty members teaching doctoral students. How do you think about doing a high quality review? Because that, I think, is sort of an important component of one's research. Okay, preparing to submit the manuscript. This is sort of basic stuff. Submit to the right journal, communicate effectively, be persistent. Clearly, if you're going to submit the public administration review and everything you cite is from the Journal of Social Work Research or Child Development or whatever, you may be looking at the wrong journal. And certainly that's one anchor for thinking about where to submit. Communicate effectively. Again, I referred to the fact that we get about 50% of our articles from outside the U.S., some from very good Europeans who speak English and write English very well, others from Europeans who speak English well but don't write English well. I'm looking at Jacob over here, but not you, Jacob. This happened. The problem of communicating effectively, though, is I go back to as many American authors and say, you've used 40 words to say something that can be said in 20. Go get an editor. And we've taken the tactic now of going to authors and say, you need to get a professional editor. We will not accept this manuscript unless you come back to us and have verified that you've gone to a professional editor. Why? Because among other things, it improves the quality of communication. But it's also important if we're trying to communicate with practitioners and we give them, let's say, a 12,000 word article. I have an identical twin brother who's a practitioner. And he looks at something that's 12,000 words and he says, cut this down to 5,000 words so I can read it. You need also to communicate with this larger audience, so it's relevant in that regard. And persistence, and this is probably advice for doctoral students who may be submitting to journals down the road, also to junior faculty. You got to be persistent. The one thing I've sort of learned, although I had some good fortune early on, but when you get a rejection and you get 3 good reviews and you know how to revise the manuscript and get it back out, but revise the manuscript. The biggest sort of error that people make is to resubmit to another journal saying, well, Public Administration Review didn't accept mine, so let me send it to American Review of Public Administration. And then the next day it's off to American Review of Public Administration. And then they send it to the same reviewers that I send it to. And the reviewer says, hey, I just saw this one and it's not been revised, and I rejected it from par. Well, so if I'm the editor of ARPA, I got an easy task on my hands saying, hey, listen, if it wasn't good enough for them and they rejected it, it's not good enough for me and it hasn't been revised. That says something about the persistence and attention of the author. The author's head is not around quality scholarship. The author's head is around maybe qualifying for that merit increase at the University of Georgia. I'm not saying this is what the Georgia people do. Yeah. Okay. Strategies, okay, for distinguishing your research. Now here's some sort of, again, very general ideas. I think one of the issues you have to confront in Hong Kong, and I say this from having been a Hong Konger myself, having been at a Chinese university and published in some of the journals. I published in I think it was the Hong Kong Journal of Public Administration, but maybe it was the Asia Journal of Public Administration. I'm looking at the current editor of the Asia Pacific Journal of Public Administration. But trying to make, let's say, taking Hong Kong, which is a small territory, but making it relevant to the sort of the expanse of audiences around the world. Because clearly one of the things you're probably going to be interested in, you're going to have access to Hong Kong data, maybe doing research in Hong Kong, but you're going to want to capture audiences in journals that don't have Hong Kong in the title, or even Asia Pacific in the title. You're going to be trying to go to important international journals. And the question is how to sort of pitch those and strategies for making your research here that's maybe Hong Kong specific relevant. Now, I don't want to diminish Hong Kong, even though it's a small territory of 7 to 8 million. What's the current?
7 million.
Yeah, 7 million. But because it's larger than Sweden, it's larger than 3 times larger than New Zealand population-wise. So there are a lot of places that are smaller than Hong Kong. It's important to keep that in mind. I don't think you ought to be apologetic because it's Hong Kong and some very interesting things go on here. You may have access to some very interesting data. But there's still the issue of sort of pitching it for the journal to which you're seeking. So one is sort of localizing universal policy issues. That is that, housing, for instance, may be important around the world. And you look at housing here in Hong Kong, either the satisfactory, the quality or satisfaction of the housing or other issues may speak to people around the world, or certainly in people in a variety of other metropolitan areas that may well be providing housing, whether it's Seoul or Tokyo or New York City or elsewhere. So you need to think about, I think, grounding it in Hong Kong, but also connecting it to these much larger policy and administration issues. The other opportunity you have here is collaborative investments in high quality databases. Now, I've met with one of the deans here the other day, and he's got a panel data set with 2 waves and a variety of interviews. I think they've run out of money to collect more data, but it's possible that database could be enhanced and used widely. And it's a Hong Kong database, but the nature of the evidence and the data in the database is such that it could speak to issues that are important around the world. So clearly there may be some opportunities for generating databases collaboratively. You may not be able to do it on your own, but you may be able to partner with other people. That may be the basis for high quality research. Strategic comparative research. Let me take one example. Transparency. We published a piece in Public Administration Review about 3 years ago that looked at East Asia, countries with sort of a Confucian origins and Confucian connection. We're talking of Japan, Korea, China. Well, rather than doing a single study on Japan, they put together a team of researchers that studied those 3 countries, trying to look at differences in Japan and maybe Japan's historical development and what consequence that had for transparency and access relative to Korea and China. So there are some opportunities, for instance, to say, Hong Kong research, it might be Hong Kong as a community, Tokyo, and Singapore, and rather than focusing on one case or one locality, to focus on multiple localities with other investigators, much easier these days with Skype, internet, and all the other things. And so that may also be a prospect for doing high quality research that involves Hong Kong, but that sort of taps into a much sort of larger perspective. Look for unaddressed fundamental assumptions. Often I think we tend, and I don't have anybody to pick on here. Jacob might know what I'm talking about. But for instance, today we have lots of hot areas. Networks and collaboration are important in public administration. The area I've worked in, public service motivation, is important. We've got a number of areas. People tend to gravitate to those areas for their current research, partly because it's hot. But the reality is that those areas started by somebody saying, hey, nobody's doing work in this area and it's not hot. And for instance, we've been talking about bureaucracies, but we ought to be talking about networks because the world is networked. So somebody started us on that path of studying networks, and that's the stuff that's most highly cited and most influential. Just like, my work in public service motivation, I won't say it's as influential as some of the other stuff, but I spent a lot of time studying rational behavior, motivation, and extrinsic rewards, and then abandoned that and said, it's not all about the extrinsic rewards, it's about the other directed behaviors that are much different than those that we're hoping to get and trying to incentivize in today's bureaucracies. And that sort of started a new line of research. So unless somebody comes along and questions the fundamental assumptions, we're going to be doing work forever within those well-developed boundaries. Develop an informal idea into a researchable concept construct. Let me again go to my area. When I was a graduate student starting in 1970, my professor said, public service is different. The public service ethic drives people in public service. I listened to that for 20 years. And I said, show me the evidence. Show me the concept. Show me the idea. It was never developed formally. It was an article of faith. So I really started a line of research that was focused on the idea of public service. I called it public service motivation because one of my Georgia colleagues in '82 wrote an article that talked about public service motivation. But it was all about this notion of public service ethic. And we tried to take what had been discussed informally and formalize it so that it was an object of study because it was important to a lot of people. And one reflection that it was important to a lot of people is a lot of people have gravitated to study this since we formalized it. And that I think is a reflection not so much of sort of my foresight, but the fact that there are a lot of ideas that are important to us, but they're informal. We need to formalize them and give them some foundation for research. And then creating measures and instruments. And of course, the other thing I did with public service motivation was to create a scale. But for instance, I have a piece now, for instance, in Public Administration Review on trust. It's trying to develop a measure of trust. That's actually analogous to some other organizational level measures, but we don't have a solid measure of trust. We've tended to rely on simple, single item questions in broad social surveys, when in fact, trust is a multifaceted concept. So taking the notion that it is multifaceted and trying to come up with a scale and a measure, I think is consistent with where our heads are at and where our talk is as scholars in that area, but it's also a foundation for doing future research. Okay, what types of methods are fashionable? I've already gone over my time. Random assignment, for those of you that were at Maureen Pirog's presentation a couple weeks ago, she kept talking about random assignment experiments and in general experimental research. Public administration review may never have carried an experiment before 2012, still in the 20th century. We've carried at least 5, maybe 6 experiments. We have one that just went on the early view yesterday by somebody from, I think, Sweden, Jenny Delict, on transparency. Experiments are, there's some reason for why I say experiments are hot. Now, I say fashionable here. I want to be careful to distinguish that people are starting to do these more frequently. That doesn't mean they're the only or the best way to do research, although I think I put some value and stock in experiments as a research methodology. Multi-method research, now I say that's hot. I'd really like to see more of it in my journal. It doesn't happen. It's interesting. A lot of authors will come to me and say, hey, listen, I want to do multi-methods, but I don't have enough space given your space limitations or whatever. Now, part of that is how creative they are about trying to convey the multi-method research, but that's certainly, I think, becoming more popular. Case studies and small-scale surveys. If I can avoid accepting, maybe even reviewing a small-scale survey, I will, because for the most part, they probably are not the foundation for moving our knowledge forward. Myths of submitting manuscripts. I'm almost done here. All manuscripts get sent out for review? No. We desk reject about 40% of the manuscripts we receive. Why? Because they're not ready for prime time. They're not ready to be reviewed. Or they don't fit our journal, so we send them back. Fix it in the mix. I know one well-regarded scholar who always thought that it was the reviewers for the journals whose responsibility it was to improve his research, rather than doing his homework in advance. He published at least 1,500 articles, but that doesn't mean he didn't send out like 6,000 articles before he got those 15. Sophisticated methods are enough. We get high quality network studies, we get Lisrel studies, other quantitative stuff, and our reviewers will say, there's a great method here, but that's it. The scholar has not done the job of sort of situating this in a larger body of research. Clearly that's not enough to sort of get something through the peer review process. No one has ever studied the question, so it's got to be surefire. Not true. It may be trivial, and therefore you need to think carefully. And this, again, going back to that social process, you want to have conversations. Is this a topic worthy of research? This is replication. Although scholars have studied variables A to Y, no one has ever studied variable X. You know, when I was in the School of Management, I had one doctoral student who said, job satisfaction. I know there are 6,000 studies on job satisfaction, but I have a new variable. Dull, uninteresting, not going to capture any attention. Thinking outside the box or getting outside the frame is, I think, the way to do significant research. So clearly that's probably not the tactic to take. Okay, non-research considerations. Pay attention to editorials. Now these are almost all reflections of my experiences with authors. I write editorials, not a lot, but I write some. Then when somebody says, hey, I've got an idea about using multi-method research, I said, well, you need to read my editorial that I published in July 2012. That's important. Most journals have editors who write at least one editorial, if not more. The Academy of Management Journal, I think, or maybe it was the Academy of Management Review, had editorials in each issue trying to convey to authors what were quality manuscripts, what was quality research. So clearly you need to read the front matter in journals as well as the articles themselves. Pay attention to other guidance. I have something that's on the Wiley website called Information for Contributors. A little bit harder to find than it should be. But in that I tell authors we have articles, we have theory to practice, we have a variety of other options if you want to submit to us. So there are a variety of ways of entering the front door of this journal. it's not clear to me that people are reading them and sort of taking some of that stuff to heart. That guidance is saying to authors, and this is the next point, we have a lot of commissioned content. What do I mean by commissioned content? Content that if you come to me with a great idea for a theory to practice article, which is essentially a translational article taking a lot of empirical evidence, synthesizing it and turning it into useful ideas or lessons for practitioners, I'm going to be very interested in that. Why? Because I don't get enough of them to publish. Almost none of them come in unsolicited. Now, either that tells me that people are too much into their databases or doing what they do day to day and to sort of get out of their normal frames, or they're not reading that stuff. But clearly, I want more commissioned articles. I had a conversation with the general editor of the American Journal of History. We have the American Historical Review and American Journal of History, both edited at Indiana University. And here's history, and he said, hey, I get commissioned articles in just about every issue. Why? As a journal editor, I don't see most of the stuff that needs to be written. A lot of things that need to be written and a lot of research that needs to be done and directions that need to be taken, at least in my view, are not being taken. Why? Because people may be all focused on that network research or all the public service motivation research. You know, here I was one of the people that started the line of research on public service motivation, and I'm the editor of the journal. I get a fair bit of it, maybe some more than I need, partly because I'm associated with it, but there's too much research out there probably on public service motivation, some of it not great, a lot of it kind of middling. I'd like to see people doing research in other areas, and because they're doing research on public service motivation, they may not be taking some other opportunities that need to be taken to advance the knowledge in the field. So this is sort of where you can have an opportunity to work with an editor and at advantage yourself. And then finally, be a good citizen. This is reviewing articles. That's important. But now you learn a lot by dealing with journals. You know, if you're not a regular reviewer for a high quality journal, it's probably going to be hard for you to understand what goes on inside that process. The only experience you will have with it if you send something to that high quality journal and they reject it or send it back and say revise and resubmit. But that's only one data point. And so as a reviewer, you might have an opportunity to experience multiple journals or the same journal multiple times. And one of the things we do now with these internet-based systems is you can see what the other reviewers say about an article. So you can say, well, I'm way off base on this. Or, we've all converged on this. This is the sort of a key limitation of the article. But you learn something from being engaged in that process. And there are other ways of being a good citizen, although that's probably the primary way. Okay, so I've left about 10 minutes now for questions, but good.
Thanks very much. Professor Perry. Perhaps it's time for questions, comment.
Now I should say I see one of your successful professors back there, Terry. But now I did a little homework and I see a couple of, Terry's actually co-authored with one of my former doctoral students. He doesn't know that. Yeah, see. So, Elizabeth Lightfoot.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So she's taken a little bit different path out of our program, but she was in my doctoral seminar about 20 years ago. And I was sort of happy to see that. Now, one of the other reasons I'm talking to you about this journal is because, for instance, you said you do work in the finance.
Financial.
Yeah. But one of the difficulties we have is, people in social work also do administration. For instance, in the aging, let me take Terry's area. We may know a lot about how administrative agencies and public policy ought to be dealing with aging, but maybe that's not been conveyed to this audience. So it's possible, for instance, that you could do a synthesis of all that research that's been ignored by people in my field and bring it across the boundary. One of the areas I've instituted is something called public administration and the disciplines. And part of the reason for that is that we don't speak to one another, even though For instance, my research on public service motivation has been connected to altruism. And even the economists talk about, they use two different words interchangeably, altruism and public service motivation. So one of the things in the most recent issue, number 2 just came out, so I don't have it. But we have one of the lead article is by 2 economists who were studying public service motivation, drawing on the public administration literature to sort of goad the economists to think about, that not everybody is sort of this rational actor out there acting in their own self-interest, that there are other interests, orientations. So I'm, as the editor of this journal, interested in people sort of crossing boundaries, just for your information. And so if it's a theory to practice piece that really is really trying to translate lessons for practitioners, I'd be happy to talk about those. That's what I call a commissioned article. And usually those have a much higher probability. Our acceptance rate is about 15%. So you got 15 out of 100 chance of being accepted. Although the reality is that since we desk reject about half, that means that if we don't desk reject you, you got a much better chance of sort of surviving the review process.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm doing this qualitative research.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested in the case studies, and you said that case studies not fashionable, but actually, well, I think it's help us in the social area,
Yeah.
to understand many things, and maybe through qualitative research we can, advance the knowledge and try in new ideas. I mean, what about in your journal is allowed that it's half and half or not more?
Case studies have a role. Case studies can help develop theory. And if you, even in this issue, I think if you look in here carefully, you'll find some of the ideas about good governance and administrative behavior grounded in case studies, but they're sort of trying to flesh out a theory that is not being tested, but is being developed in the context of the case study. And that's a useful or appropriate use of case studies. There's also another line of research methodology called case survey research. I've done some of that. For instance, I studied whistleblowers in the federal government. But I took 100 cases of whistleblowers and coded those cases and then looked at them statistically. It wasn't a large sample, but it was using evidence that was available through other sources rather than going out and surveying. It was maybe a more objective data because I was asking questions of the cases. Robert Yin is associated with that idea and very successful, and a lot of people follow that. So I think we need to be careful about what we call qualitative research, though. It's not just going out and saying, I'm here to do research. It still needs to be systematic, well thought through. It has to fit the research questions you have. That is, for instance, if we're asking a question, how do organizations interact with, how do social workers interact with their clients? And I want to do some participant observation, I want to do some direct observation, and I have a systematic way of inquiring about that, then that makes good sense. And of course there is a line of research on grounded theory, which is very popular in my place, and we'll also publish grounded theory, but grounded theory is not, has a method and a logic behind it that I want to see the scholars who are applying it apply the method and logic with that methodology. So case study, a single shot case study that is, we got one recently and I got beat up at a conference I went to a couple of weeks ago. I said, you were desk rejected our article. I said, well, yeah. He said, we had a case in there. We tested this governance, collaborative governance with a case. I said, well, that doesn't, if you're using the case to disconfirm the theory, it's not a particularly good way to try to do that. So, but you could use the case in other ways.
Comments?
I have another question.
Yeah.
It's different. have a lot of experience in this field in the public administration and also in the journal. What is in your experience, or do you know along these years if you have found out that some research has made impact for policymakers and changing the policy, you know? I would like the impact actually from some, articles or, I'm not so sure, from your journal.
You say,
Impact.
does any of this research have impact?
Impact of
Yeah.
actually making, changing
Yeah.
the policy.
That's actually a question we don't ask very often. And it does separate the journals. I'm interested in trying to have an impact. But some of the research we do doesn't. One of the other areas I did research on before public service motivation was merit pay or pay for performance. And I do know, matter of fact, I came to Hong Kong in 1999 and told the deputy civil service director they proposed to do performance pay. I said, bad idea, not going to work, going to create problems. And they never embarked on that. Now it's hard for me to assess non-action, but I think that advice or some of that, I know some of the research has led people to look at performance pay and then to abandon it simply because the evidence is not strong enough to pursue it. Although a lot of our politicians keep coming back to it, so they impose a different logic on the bureaucracy and says this is there's also you may be familiar with institutional theory out of sociology where people in effect do certain things for legitimacy's sake, and it may be that somebody looks at an organization and says, you're not doing merit pay, you can't be a very good organization. But the reality is that if they knew anything about that organization, they might understand why you're not doing it. But there is sort of impositions on people because of the expectations of outsiders. But so I think that we have one of our 75 most influential articles written by the late Carol Weiss, published in 1989, I believe, on utilization of research. You might want to look at that. There hasn't been a whole lot done since then. Now the current language is evidence-based. Evidence-based policy, evidence-based social work, I'm sure, evidence-based management. I'm a little bit skeptical about some of that stuff, although I really do want to start a feature in the journal called Evidence-Based Policy and Administration that looks at, for instance, this last week the U.S. Partnership for Public Service came out with a report that said we need to reform the American federal civil service. What evidence did they have behind that, and was it good evidence? We also have the U.S. Office of Management and Budget says that you need to do performance contracting, but we also know a lot about performance contracting that's contrary to their rule or regulation. So we need to find better ways of applying what we know to what's going on in these public jurisdictions. But again, remember, social work may be isn't immune from this, but in the public sector we have the administrators, we have the politicians, and ultimately in constitutional governance, although Hong Kong is a little different, but in democratic governance, constitutional, usually the politicians superimpose themselves on the administration. So even if the administrators may know what to do, some of them do, some of them don't, what needs to get done may not get done because of the direction of the politicians. So we need, that's certainly an issue with which we need to contend. We need to find better ways of connecting the different stakeholders.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the not trying to follow the fad and trying to kind of carve in a new area. So a lot of journals want really recent dates in terms of referencing previous knowledge on the topic. If you're going back to say maybe an idea that was there in the 70s that may be relevant to today but hasn't been evaluated in this newer modern age. How receptive are journals to, I guess, pieces that have, I don't want to say antiquated pieces, but older pieces? Because I feel that the rule is, okay, try to have the most current, up-to-date issues, but if everyone's kind of following the wind
Yeah.
between, 2010 and now, in this direction, and you want to go in this direction, but it's older articles,
Yeah.
how about that?
Well, I think first of all, you need to sort of appeal to something more than the citations. It has to, if it's sort of problem focused, or if there's some timeliness to it, you need to be able to make that case first. Jacob and I were having a conversation. Jacob's doing research on innovation, right? Yeah. And the conversation was, have you found my research that I published about 8 studies in the 1970s out of a NSF study on innovation, public innovation? Well, as a journal, this is sort of a small irritant, both from my personal research, but also from the attentiveness of authors. There are lots of research that's been done previously that's been forgotten, that may in fact take the current fads or whatever and take one in a different direction. The area I did my dissertation on, public sector collective bargaining, for about, in 1980, President Reagan fired the air traffic controllers when they went out on strike. From 1980 until 2005 or maybe 2010, nobody paid attention to that area. Why? Because the influence of the unions had gone away. Now we're sort of in a new era where the politicians are again attacking the unions for reasons related to their success in the 1980s. So that sort of generated a new presence for that. But if somebody's going to be studying that, they need to be going back to some of that research. But it might be a way of framing, let's say, the union issue in ways that are quite different from the concerns that people raised in the 1970s. In the 1970s, it was like the sky is falling, we're all caving into the unions are taking over the world. Well, once Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers, we knew that wasn't true. But then we walked away from the research, but now there's a whole new set of issues. So one might be returning to that, but I think they also have to be cognizant of that line of research over the years. But I think you also have to sort of look for ways that saying, and this goes back to this fundamental assumption issue. You need to find ways of saying, we missed something critical here and it's been ignored. Or we're going in this line when this other line over here had lots of promise and we're ignoring it. It may be more efficient and make a lot more sense. For instance, the pay for performance, one of the reasons I sort of took issue with the pay for performance is that governments operate on something we call budgets. What's the limitation of budgets? Well, that's it. They're limited. They're not unlimited, right? And corporations can get by paying people big bucks. Governments can pay people peanuts, and if they go beyond the peanuts, then the public gets up in arms and saying you're giving, except in Hong Kong, pays much better in Hong Kong. So you need to also be looking for solutions that are feasible. And here we're pointing, the politicians are pointing, saying use the merit pay. And then the politicians are saying, but I'm not going to give you any money. So that means you got a zero-sum game over here. That doesn't play very well with the people who are under those rules. And so it doesn't make good logic or good sense in the long run to pursue that direction. But you may need to sort of speak, it's sort of called speaking truth to power. That is, you may need to say, this is the logic of what we know about human behavior, and you're trying to ignore that. And it may be politically successful or useful, but it's not behaviorally helpful to create effective organizations or policy systems.
Well,
one last question.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm interested in one of your slides talking about overcoming the challenges. And your second bullet point, as I remember, is rising above the kind of expectation to publish in high impact factor, contributing to the university ranking.
It's here somewhere.
Yes. Next one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Short-term
Yeah,
behaviors.
so rising above the short-term behaviors,
Yeah.
I am kind of old enough to think, well, I just have to bite the bullet, buy my time, and publish in places with apparent high impact factor, etc., etc. I wonder whether you have
Yeah.
magic thinking or
Yeah.
smarter thinking on
Yeah.
this.
Well, there are often trade-offs here, though, and I'm not saying don't public, but let's say untenured faculty coming up for tenure have raised the question: okay, do I go to journal X that's rated number 5, or do I go to journal number 1? And I got a consequential decision coming up in 2 years. Can I afford not to get it somewhere? And I think I can get to 5, but I may not be able to get to 1. So that means you may be placing your research in a suboptimal journal in part because of the reward system. I personally, I always was looking, I think I've had some latitude to do that, but I was looking 5 years out rather than saying, hey, I can get this article published now, or if I spend my time on that, I can get this article published now. But if I apply for this research grant, and it may be 3 years before I get a payoff, but I'm going to be a lot happier with that because I'm going to have some opportunities to get better funding and really to do much more consequential research then. So I think you need to think about those trade-offs. But going back to the Boyer report, part of the issue is that some of the university rules are also maybe counterproductive to the development of new knowledge. And again, this conversation I had earlier today, talking about a particular discipline, has become highly technical. People are doing very elegant technical research, but nobody understands it, and it doesn't communicate with anybody outside of their small stream of people. I've encountered this in terms of trying to go across boundaries. The head economist at the World Bank, or for the Development Economists Group, cited one of my articles. Why did I know that? Because I get notifications when the article gets cited.
Yes.
And so I got a notification. Immediately upon getting the notification, I emailed him and said, I'd like to publish this, or at least consider it seriously for public administration review, because it speaks to the issues about which we're publishing. But he said, no, I need to publish in the Journal of Public Economics. Why? Because there was a debate between 2 economics groups about this particular issue, and there was maybe more status in getting in the Econ Journal, and it also put him on a platform that he could debate with the other person. Now maybe that's good in the long run, but it also sort of diminishes the prospect of getting that research to this broader audience. So at least my hope in the long run is he'll sort of step back from that and synthesize a bunch of that stuff and share it with my readership. But because of the esteem and simply the internal disciplinary dynamics, he wasn't able to come to me. When else, I have another issue with another article I've been trying to solicit on an experiment. And since the experiments are becoming more common, I'm trying to recruit more of those. But there's a new journal in political science, and by the way, one reason why I emphasize experiments are becoming more common is that the American Political Science Association now has a section on experimental political science. Economics has given a lot of attention to experiments. But I'm trying to solicit this article from a group of people, including one of my junior colleagues 2 doors from my door in Bloomington, in my office suite. But they're still debating. There's a new journal on experiments in political science coming out with Cambridge Press later in the year. It's going to be seen by at least 14 people. But again, that's not, I don't want to diminish the Cambridge, and, there's maybe something to be said, but, they could see that same experiment in my journal, and get to 5,600 institutions. I don't know who's going to see it when it gets into that small group of experimental political scientists. So, but again, it's partly related to the incentives and some of them are perverse, and I think we need to find ways of getting beyond that. Interestingly, I have a lot more success with Europeans who seem to be less hidebound, less affected by the boundaries. Because the economists I published in issue 2 here had no problem opting for my journal rather than the economics journal that they were toward which they were headed and toward which they had gone through a couple of reviews already. When I said, this is perfect for our readership and I can make a fast decision on it. They moved it over, but until we get folks who are comfortable moving across these boundaries, we still have our work cut out for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Perry, for your presentation and sharing. And I would say bon voyage for your publication. And let our head of department, Cecilia, Professor Cecilia, to present our souvenir.
Hey, you can never. Thank you. We have a photo.
No,
Okay, we don't
it's
need
all
a.
right.
Okay. Well, hey, I like that. It's got the fingerprints. My wife will love that too. My wife is a child care person, so child care administrator actually. Social work and social at the University of Hong Kong. Excellent. And this will go well with my Starbucks when I get home.
Okay,
I could use it here, but thank you.